Welcome back, Spartans. This is the third video in my mini-series on acing the interview process. Today I'm going to share with you the cybersecurity concepts you should be aware of and understand if you want to become a successful cybersecurity professional. In the interest of time, I will not be diving deeper into each concept. I will instead give you an idea of why the concept is relevant whenever I feel it's necessary. You don't need to understand all of the concepts in depth, as some of them can be quite complex. Many of the concepts that I'm about to describe are the bread and butter of professionals with years of experience. My goal here is to highlight the most relevant topics and ideas while giving you a bunch of other buzzwords that you can research at your own pace. As someone who has been in the industry for over 10 years, I can say that over 90% of the concepts described in this video have appeared in some shape or form in one or more of my roles. Let's begin. Let's start with the core concepts that you are going to need regardless of the area of cybersecurity that you choose. First, we have the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These are core principles that must be followed to protect data and systems. Then we have authentication, authorization, accounting, and non-repudiation. These are the four tenets for securing access to resources in a network. You will also see these concepts in the context of cryptography. Then we have zero trust and defense in depth. These are modern security concepts that build upon the concepts that I've just shared and other security concepts such as IAM, DLP, MFA, least privilege principle, and cryptography, to keep security threats at bay and minimize the impact of breaches. Next, we have risk management and threat modeling, because you can only protect yourself if you know the risks and the attack vectors. Then we have cryptography and encryption, shared responsibility model for the cloud, and this one is quite useful to understand because most companies these days use the cloud in some shape or form. Red, blue, and purple teams, these are the attackers, defenders, and the mediators. And if you are curious about the difference between red and blue teams, I highly recommend that you check my video on this topic that I will link in the description. Finally, we have areas of cybersecurity, and these include governance, risk and compliance, or GRC, security operations, security engineering, application security, threat intelligence and threat research, and finally, offensive security. Now let's talk about frameworks and standards. We start with Lockheed Martin's Cyberkill Chain and the MITRE ATT&CK framework. While the Cyberkill Chain provides a high-level overview of the full lifecycle of a compromise, the MITRE ATT&CK framework dives deeper and is a more comprehensive framework on tactics and techniques used by threat actors. Next, we have the OWASP Top 10, which is the top 10 most critical security risks to web applications. And finally, we have the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which is a set of guidelines that organizations can follow to build and improve their cybersecurity posture. It is important that you fully understand these frameworks that I've just shared because they are likely the easiest to learn and remember. The rest of the list includes frameworks that you don't really need to fully understand, unless you are applying for a strategic position, such as VP of Security or CISO, or a role in GRC. However, there is a high probability that you are going to run into them at some point, so it's worth understanding them at a high level. We start with the CIS controls and benchmarks, where CIS stands for Center for Internet Security. CIS controls are a set of prioritized security actions that companies can use to protect their assets. CIS benchmarks, on the other hand, are more specific and help organizations secure well-known and widely used software, for instance Windows, or more complex services like AWS and Azure. Up next we have ISO 27001 and SOC 2. These are standards that require organizations to implement and maintain specific processes and controls to protect sensitive information, demonstrating to auditors and customers their commitment to information security. We also have data-specific frameworks such as HIPAA, which means Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and PCI DSS, which means Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. These are standards that focus on specific types of data and sectors. Besides what I just mentioned, you have a lot of resources and documentation online from NIST, CIS, and the Cloud Security Alliance. As an example from NIST, you have the Special Publication Series, or SP, for instance, the SP 861, which is the Computer Security Incident Handling Guide, 892, which is the Guide to Computer Security Log Management. From CIS, you have CIS Controls Cloud Companion Guide, and finally you have the Security Guidance from the Cloud Security Alliance. Now that we've touched on core concepts and frameworks, it is time to get a bit more specific. Let's talk about offensive security, threats, and attack vectors. And I'm going to start with some buzzwords. The first is indicators of compromise, or IOCs. IOCs are any pieces of forensics data or evidence related to a security breach or a malicious activity. Examples of IOCs include file hashes, IPs, domains, and URLs. Then we have tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs. And these are patterns of behavior or activities associated with attackers during different stages of an attack. Then we have advanced persistent threats, or APTs. And these are usually well-organized and well-funded adversarial groups. If you work in a SOC, most of your days are going to spend dealing with boring malware or not so sophisticated campaigns. I remember that back when I was working at FireEye, every analyst would keep their eyes peeled for any APT activity. This was because the attacks tend to be quite sophisticated and interesting, and detecting them before anyone else was kind of a flex. Then we have vulnerabilities, vulnerability scanners, 0 days, and exploits, because exploits are quite used by attackers to break into applications, servers, and even networks. Then we have offensive security processes and tooling, because as a red teamer or a pen tester, there are steps and procedures that you must follow during your engagements, and you also need tools to automate your efforts. And finally, we have some common types of attacks, such as phishing, malware infections, denial of service, which can be distributed or not, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, man-in-the-middle attacks, buffer overflows, privilege escalation, brute force attacks, credential stuffing, and finally, social engineering. Knowing how to attack, it is now time to see how to defend, monitor, and detect. In an ideal world, you'd set up a firewall and move on with your life. However, the reality is that that is not enough and breaches are just a fact of life. You need to verify that no ill-intentioned individual or group managed to bypass your defenses. This is where monitoring and detecting comes into play. We start with intrusion detection systems or IDSs, or intrusion prevention systems or IPSs. And these are used to detect or block malicious activity in a network or system. Next, we have user and entity behavior analytics, or WEBA, and this is an approach to detecting malicious activity based on deviations from a baseline. This contrasts with classic detections that require a hard-coded rule that never changes. As an example, if a user logs into Gmail from US all the time, a login from China should trigger an alert, as this login deviates from the norm. Next, we have network traffic collection and analysis, because monitoring, detecting, and responding to incidents requires traffic collection and analysis. Then we have antivirus and anti-malware solutions, such as EDRs and XDRs, where EDR stands for Endpoint Detection and Response, and XDR stands for Extended Detection and Response. We have security orchestration and automation tools, or SOARs, that can help you automate response to alerts and incidents. We have firewalls, classic firewalls, next-gen firewalls, and web application firewalls, or WAFs. Virtual private networks, or VPNs, which are usually used to access services that are behind security solutions like firewalls or inside private networks. Network segmentation, which is a security measure to limit the potential impact of a breach. We have data backup and recovery, because sometimes, even with all the security controls in place, attackers can still get to the data and destroy it or encrypt it. When this happens, the last resort is restoring the data from backups. Then we have containers, sandboxes, and virtual machines. These are all forms of code execution with different degrees of security and isolation. Sandboxes are widely used by AVs, while virtual machines are quite used by malware researchers and security operations analysts. Next, we have log management and SIEMs, where SIEMs stand for Security Information and Event Management. Detections rely on logs, which can be collecting using simple log management solutions such as Kibana or a SIEM like Sumo. The difference is that SIEMs are designed for security purposes, while log management solutions are primarily used for basic log searching. SIEMs trigger alerts based on hard-coded rules or more complex heuristics, such as user and identity behavior analytics, or WEBA, which I described before. And finally, we have vulnerability and patch management. And the goal of these two is identifying vulnerabilities across the organization and patching them in a systematic and automated fashion. It is now time to talk about incident response, because when all the security measures in place fail and attackers manage to breach the network, incident responders take over, following a playbook defined in advance. Incident response involves many of the concepts mentioned earlier, such as EDRs, XDRs, SOARs, log management, SIEMs, etc. Incident response is a combination of tools and processes, and there are a few industry guidelines that tend to be followed directly or indirectly by most organizations, such as the NIST 861, which I mentioned before. The first thing to bear in mind is types of incidents, and this goes back to the types of attacks, such as malware infections, phishing, denial of service, etc. Then we have the phases of incident response, which according to the NIST 861 are preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned. Preparation and detection are part of the previous section, defending, monitoring, and detecting, while the remaining phases begin when the incident response process starts. Another thing to bear in mind is roles during incident response, incident responders, forensics analysts, reverse engineers, threat intelligence specialists, SecOps analysts, legal department, and IT staff. If you become part of incident response, SecOps, or forensics teams, you must be able to do forensics analysis of network traffic and hardware, such as hard drives, as well as analysis of malware and indicators of compromise. During the incident, companies involved in the response must know how to preserve forensics evidence, and they must also be ready to engage with the necessary authorities to report the activity. Because according to GDPR, companies are required to report breaches under certain circumstances. And finally, companies must keep their incident response skills sharp, and this is where incident response drills and tabletops come into play. I won't even pretend that this list is reasonable, because it isn't. It can be overwhelming, especially for a beginner. However, it is important to understand that this video is field agnostic. Preparing for an interview in a specific field requires you to study that field in depth and familiarize yourself with the most common questions. The concepts I shared today are cross-functional, and you will encounter them in some form wherever you work. Now you might be thinking, okay Bruno, that sounds great, but how do I technically prepare for an interview? That is a topic for the next video. Until next time, stay safe, stay paranoid.